I can't believe I'm finally winning, Jake said, his voice loud over the hum of laughter and clinking glasses. Ella? Yeah, she's still trying to figure out her life. Meanwhile, I've got it all: wife, success, everything she never could handle. The crowd around him murmured their agreement, nodding and laughing, as if Jake's words were gospel. But what Jake didn't know was that a single headline was about to change everything he thought he knew about himself, about Ella, and about the world he thought he had mastered. Have you ever looked back on someone from your past and realized they were far stronger than you gave them credit for? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if you've ever underestimated someone, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. Jake stood at the center of a lavish rooftop party in downtown Los Angeles, a city of glitz and neon lights. The night air was warm, the scent of expensive cologne and cocktails swirling around him. The party was his playground, and he was basking in the glow of his new life. A new wife, a booming business, and a group of people who adored him. Everything felt like a carefully curated masterpiece. To new beginnings, Jake said, raising his glass toward his friends. His new wife, Megan, was beside him, her bright smile framed perfectly under the dim lights, her youthful energy matching Jake's enthusiasm. Jake's eyes gleamed as he surveyed the room. It was everything he had dreamed of. The success, the admiration, he had it all. And, of course, his past marriage to Ella, which he liked to joke about now, felt like an afterthought, something he could laugh at over drinks with his new friends. Honestly, I think I dodged a bullet with Ella, Jake said to a group of men standing around him. She was always so distracted. Never really got it together, you know? She was a nice person, but her priorities were all wrong. She was never gonna thrive like I did. Laughter erupted from the group, and Jake leaned back, savoring the sound of their approval. He didn't notice how the tone of his voice had shifted. What once felt like a simple reflection on a past relationship now had a sharper edge. And beneath his boastful exterior, there was something else. A deep, unspoken need to prove he was better off, that he had made the right choice when he walked away from Ella. Man, you've got it all now, don't you? One of his friends, Dave, clapped Jake on the back. A new wife, your business booming, you're living the dream. Hell yeah, Jake said, a smile creeping across his face. I've earned every bit of it. Ella? She's still out there somewhere, trying to figure out what went wrong. But me? I've moved on. I've got it all together. Across the room, Megan watched Jake with a practiced smile, her eyes glinting with admiration. She knew how much he loved being the center of attention, how much he thrived off the praise. But even Megan, who was happily swept up in Jake's world, couldn't help but wonder about his obsession with his past marriage. Ella, in his mind, was a footnote to the success he had now. The party continued on, but Jake didn't notice how his words hung in the air, how they slipped under the surface like cracks in the foundation of his perfect life. To everyone around him, he was a man on top of the world. But to those who knew the real story, like his ex-wife Ella, he was still living in a shadow he couldn't see. While Jake continued to boast, a quiet storm was brewing on the other side of the city, a storm he would never see coming. In a sleek office in the heart of Los Angeles, Ella was sitting in front of a wall of monitors, a tablet in her hand. She tapped a few commands, her eyes scanning numbers and projections that made Jake's business seem small in comparison. Ella hadn't been the woman Jake thought he'd left behind. Over the years, she had built something of her own, quietly amassing influence and wealth, working behind the scenes. Her rise was nothing like Jake's, no parties, no public boasts. It was slow, deliberate, and entirely hers. And now, she was on the verge of something huge. Jake was halfway through another boast when a waiter appeared with his phone, holding it up with a look that seemed to carry more than just a routine message. Mr. Jameson, the waiter said, I think you'll want to see this. Jake frowned, taking the phone and glancing at the breaking news headline. His face went pale as he read the words, Ella Jameson becomes the world's youngest female billionaire heiress after recent acquisition of global tech firm. For a second, Jake couldn't breathe. The words didn't sink in. He read them again and again, but it was real. His ex-wife, whom he had dismissed so easily, was now the owner of an empire. A mix of disbelief and a strange unease washed over him. It didn't make sense. How? When? He looked up from the phone, his chest tightening. Megan, who had been standing beside him, noticed the shift in his demeanor. Jake? What's wrong? He didn't answer at first. He just stared at the phone in his hand. The crowd continued to celebrate around him, oblivious to the bombshell he had just read. Jake's mind raced, his self-assurance cracking for the first time in years. Ella, the woman he had so easily written off, had just become a billion-dollar force. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt small. Megan's voice broke through his thoughts. Jake, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost. But Jake wasn't listening. He was already scrolling through news articles about Ella, each one a painful reminder of everything he thought he knew about her, and everything he had missed. Jake's hand trembled slightly as he lowered the phone, his mind still reeling. The words on the screen had felt like a punch to the gut. Ella Jameson, billionaire heiress. He couldn't shake them. It wasn't possible. Not the quiet, modest woman he'd once dismissed. But there it was, staring at him in black and white. Megan stood beside him, her eyes scanning his face, her concern growing. Jake, talk to me. What's going on? He looked up, feeling the weight of the moment crash down on him. Megan's voice was distant now, a blur. Everything had shifted in an instant. I didn't expect this, Jake stammered, his usual smooth confidence slipping away. Ella, I thought she was just some quiet woman, out of her depth. But this. He exhaled sharply, as if trying to expel the tightness in his chest. Megan placed her hand gently on his arm, but Jake didn't notice. His thoughts were elsewhere. He needed to see her. He needed to understand how this could have happened. I've got to go, Jake muttered, turning toward the door. I need to talk to her. Ella wasn't at a glamorous party or high-profile event when Jake's world started to unravel. Instead, she was in a sleek, minimalist office, the kind of place Jake would have never imagined her walking into. The phone call that had changed everything was over, and now Ella leaned back in her chair, staring out at the Los Angeles skyline. There were no grand celebrations for her, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had done this on her own. She had earned it, and while her ex-husband, Jake, had been living the high life, thinking she was struggling, Ella had been quietly building her empire. Her success was hard-won, but to Ella it was just another chapter. It was everything she had worked for, but it didn't change who she was. It was just the next step in a long journey, one she had started long before Jake ever crossed her path. Jake drove through the busy streets of Los Angeles, his mind a blur. The night's excitement felt distant, hollow. He couldn't focus on anything but the nagging feeling growing inside him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The car ride felt endless. He tried to push the thoughts of Ella aside, but they kept creeping back in. How did she do it? How did she become this force, this billionaire, without me even noticing? He parked outside a sleek building. It wasn't a place he had ever visited, not since the divorce. Ella had kept her distance from him, and he'd respected that. Or at least he had pretended to. His hands shook as he walked toward the entrance. The cold night air bit at his skin, but he barely felt it. When he entered, the receptionist barely looked up, already familiar with him. Mr. Jameson, right? She said, her tone polite but distant. She picked up the phone and dialed without another word, already aware of what was happening. Jake stood in silence, his chest tight as he waited. The whole building felt like it was closing in on him. And yet, the further he walked into Ella's world, the more it felt like he was leaving his behind. Minutes passed before a familiar voice called from behind him. Jake! He froze. There she was, Ella. No longer the woman he had once left behind. She was standing in front of him, taller, more poised than he remembered, but still that same quiet strength he'd never appreciated. Her gaze locked with his. Her eyes didn't show fear or hesitation, just calm certainty. There was no nervousness in her stance, no need for him to reassure her. She had outgrown him. I didn't expect to see you here, Ella said, her voice neutral, though there was an edge of something. Perhaps pity, perhaps indifference. Jake swallowed hard. I didn't know you were doing this, becoming a billionaire. How? Why didn't you say anything? Ella took a slow breath, her expression unreadable. She didn't look like the woman he had left behind. She looked like someone who had found her place in the world, who had carved out her space without anyone's help. She didn't owe him answers. And yet, for some reason, he felt entitled to them. You never asked, Jake, Ella said softly. You always thought you had it all figured out, but you never bothered to look beyond the surface. You never cared to see what I was doing, who I was becoming. Jake's chest tightened. He could feel the sting of her words, the truth behind them. He had never really looked at Ella. Not the way she deserved. Not the way he should have. I just thought. Jake trailed off. He couldn't finish the sentence. He had thought she would always be the person who stayed in his shadow, who would never have the strength or the means to break free. But you were wrong, Ella said, as if reading his thoughts. I was always going to be more than what you saw. But I didn't need you to see me. I did this on my own. She stepped forward, her presence no longer something he could ignore. And that's something you'll never understand. There was no anger in her voice, just a calm finality. Jake realized then that Ella had moved on. She wasn't bitter or resentful. She had simply outgrown him, and there was nothing left to salvage between them. Jake opened his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat. And before he could form another thought, Ella turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, the weight of her success pressing down on him. Jake's hands were still shaking as he sat in his car outside Ella's building. The events of the past hour played in his mind like a loop, each word she said hitting him harder than the last. I did this on my own. Those words echoed in his head. Relentless. They weren't just a statement. They were a reminder of everything he'd missed, everything he had assumed. He could still hear her voice, calm but final. You never cared to see what I was doing. I never cared, Jake thought bitterly. And it made his stomach turn. The woman he had dismissed so easily, the woman he had walked away from, had somehow built an empire without him. She had done everything she promised herself she would. And Jake? He was still chasing the validation of others, still bragging about his new life to people who barely cared. His phone buzzed. The screen lit up with Megan's name. He ignored it. What was he supposed to say now? Hey, I ran into Ella and guess what? She's a billionaire now, while I'm still pretending to have it all together. He scoffed. He had built his life around the image of success, but it was crumbling. Ella had been the one thing he had never truly seen until now. But Jake couldn't let go of the image he had worked so hard to create. He wasn't ready to face the truth. Not yet. Meanwhile, Ella was sitting at her desk in her quiet office, scrolling through a set of documents. The weight of her success had yet to fully hit her, and maybe it never would. She wasn't in this for the accolades. She didn't want the recognition. She wanted freedom. She had learned how to succeed in a world that didn't believe in her, starting with Jake. She picked up a picture frame on her desk. It was an old photo from her wedding to Jake, a moment before everything fell apart. She hadn't taken the photo down, not because of the memory, but because it was a reminder of what she had overcome, of how far she'd come. She didn't know what Jake would do with the news, but she didn't need him to validate her. She had moved on, and the past, no matter how much it had shaped her, wasn't something she could live in anymore. But there was a lingering feeling, a question she couldn't shake. Would Jake ever understand? And more importantly, did it even matter anymore? Jake finally started the car. His mind was racing, but he couldn't face Ella again. Not now. Not with the way he felt. He drove around the city aimlessly, the streets unfamiliar, his thoughts clouded. He ended up at the same bar he had gone to after his divorce. It was a quiet place, the kind where everyone knew your name, but nobody asked too many questions. He sat at the bar, nursing a drink, the sound of clinking glasses and low conversations buzzing around him. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Megan. Are you okay? I haven't heard from you in hours. Jake stared at the message for a long time, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't okay, but he didn't want to talk about it. Not yet. Instead, he typed back a simple reply, "I'm fine. Just need some space." He set the phone down and took a long sip of his drink, trying to quiet the noise in his head. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ella's face. Strong, poised, confident, and he couldn't shake the nagging question. Why didn't I see this coming? He had underestimated her, written her off as someone who would always be in his shadow. But now he was the one feeling small, and Ella was standing tall, untouched by the cracks in his life. As the night wore on, Jake couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with Ella. Her words were still alive in his head, replaying over and over. He needed to reach out to her. He needed to understand. But the deeper the guilt sank in, the harder it became to face the truth. And just when he thought he couldn't avoid it any longer, his phone buzzed again. But this time it wasn't Megan. It was a call from Ella. Jake couldn't ignore the call. His heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the screen. Ella. His finger hovered over the screen, uncertainty holding him in place. After everything he'd said, after all the years of avoiding her, was he ready to face her again? He pressed the green button. Jake! Ella's voice came through clearly, but there was no warmth, no trace of the woman he once knew. It was controlled calm. Ella, he said, his throat tight. I didn't expect to hear from you. I'm sure you didn't, she replied. But I need to talk to you. Can we meet? There was a long pause, the silence between them heavy with unspoken history. Jake had imagined this moment 100 times, but now that it was real, he didn't know what to say. Yeah, sure. When? Now, she said, her voice final. I'm at your old spot, the bar we used to go to. His stomach dropped. He hadn't set foot in that bar in years. The place where they used to sit for hours, talking about everything and nothing, laughing together before everything had changed. I'll be there, Jake said before hanging up. The drive to the bar felt endless. Jake's hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. His mind raced. What did she want? Why now? Part of him felt angry, another part, uncertain, vulnerable. He hadn't allowed himself to think about Ella in so long. Now she was back in his life and nothing felt clear anymore. As he pulled into the parking lot, Jake noticed how quiet the neighborhood had become. The bright city lights of downtown LA felt miles away. The bar was unchanged, still tucked between two old buildings, the neon sign flickering with a faded glow. He parked and stepped out, his shoes clicking on the pavement. The door creaked as he entered, and the familiar smells of whiskey, old wood, and cigar smoke hit him. The place was nearly empty, save for a few late-night regulars hunched over their drinks. And then he saw her. Ella was sitting at a corner booth, facing the door. Her hair, darker now than he remembered, cascaded past her shoulders. She wasn't the girl he once knew, the one who would laugh at his jokes and ask about his day. She was different now, stronger, more composed, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she had outgrown him. Ella, Jake said, his voice softer than he intended. She looked up at him, her eyes steady, unflinching. Jake, she replied, her lips forming the faintest of smiles. But it wasn't the smile he remembered. It wasn't warm. It was polite, detached. He sat across from her, the space between them feeling enormous. She had invited him here, but there was no warmth in her invitation. Only something else, something he couldn't quite place. What's this about, Ella? Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She folded her hands in front of her, calm and collected. I wanted to see you, to talk about everything that's happened. Jake felt a flicker of frustration. What's to talk about? You're a billionaire now, Ella. You've clearly done just fine without me. He didn't mean to sound bitter, but he couldn't help it. She had built her empire without him. What was the point of all this? Ella's eyes didn't waver. This isn't about money, Jake. It never was. Her voice was quiet, measured. I've spent years building something real, something that has nothing to do with you or the life we used to have. But I need you to understand something. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, feeling the weight of her words. I never wanted your validation, Ella continued, her voice still steady, but there was a hint of something else now, something raw. I did it for me, for the person I knew I could be, even when you didn't see it. Even when you thought I wasn't enough. The words hit him harder than he expected. His pride stung. He had always been so sure of himself, so certain that he had made the right choices. But now, sitting in front of Ella, all of that confidence seemed misplaced, fragile. She was right. He had never seen her for who she was. He had only seen her as the person who had stood beside him, never as the force that she had become on her own. I didn't think you could do it, Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt foreign on his tongue, as though they didn't belong to him. I thought you'd always need someone to take care of you. Ella didn't flinch. I never needed anyone to take care of me, Jake. I needed myself. And now I have that. For the first time, Jake felt small. All the bravado he had carried with him for years felt meaningless now. He had let his pride cloud everything. And Ella? She had built something far more powerful than anything he could have imagined. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the woman she had become. A woman who was no longer a part of his past, but a force to be reckoned with in the present. Jake opened his mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He was struck silent by the realization that Ella didn't need him. She never had. And as she stood up to leave, she looked at him one last time. I hope you find what you're looking for, Jake, she said quietly, her gaze unyielding. But you'll have to find it without me. As she walked away, Jake sat there, paralyzed by the weight of her words. He had never felt more lost. Jake sat alone at the bar, the dim light casting long shadows across the wooden surface. The glass in his hand was half empty, the ice long melted. He stared at it, but his thoughts were a million miles away. The conversation with Ella had left him shaken. Her calm, unwavering confidence was something he hadn't been prepared for. She's not the woman I left behind, he thought, frustration clawing at him. She's someone else now, someone I could have never imagined. His phone buzzed again, dragging him out of his spiraling thoughts. Megan's name flashed on the screen, and for a moment he hesitated. He hadn't spoken to her since the night of the party. It wasn't like he'd been avoiding her. He just didn't know how to explain what was happening in his head. How could he tell her that everything he thought he knew was falling apart? How could he admit that his ex-wife, the woman he'd spent years dismissing, had become something he could barely recognize? He answered the call. Jake? Are you okay? Megan's voice was filled with concern. I've been trying to reach you all night. I'm fine, he said, trying to sound convincing. I just needed some space to think. About what? Jake, you've been acting weird ever since we got back from that party. She paused, and Jake could hear her breath catch. Is it about Ella? A wave of guilt hit him like a brick. He had spent so many years convincing himself that he was better off without Ella. That he was the one who had moved on, the one who had made the right choice. But now, staring down at the empty glass in his hand, it felt like he had been lying to himself. I ran into her, Jake said finally, his voice quieter now. I didn't expect to see her again. She's different, Megan. She's not who I thought she was. There was silence on the other end of the line. Megan didn't speak, but Jake could feel the weight of her attention, her eyes waiting for him to continue. She's a billionaire now, Megan, Jake whispered, as if the words themselves were too heavy to say out loud. She's built something I could never understand, and here I am, still pretending that I've got it all figured out. Megan let out a long breath. Jake, I don't know what's going on, but you're not going to figure it out sitting in a bar. You need to face this head-on, whatever this is. You've been running from it for years. Jake didn't respond. He didn't have anything left to say. He had spent so much time convincing himself that he was in control, that he had the perfect life. But the truth was staring him in the face now. Ella wasn't just a part of his past. She was someone he had never truly seen, and now it was too late. Meanwhile, Ella was at home, sitting on her couch in the quiet of the night. Her phone buzzed with the latest headlines about her growing empire, but she didn't bother reading them. She had worked hard to get where she was, and yet, the only thing that kept running through her mind was Jake. She had spent years running from him, from the pain he had caused her. And now he was back in her life, like a shadow she couldn't shake. But she wasn't angry. No, Ella wasn't angry anymore. She had let go of that a long time ago. But she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of loss. A loss that had nothing to do with money or success. It was a loss of something she had once hoped for. A hope that she had buried long ago. She stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the city lights. What if Jake had seen me for who I was? She wondered. What if he had recognized what I was capable of? But it was too late for what-ifs. Ella had built her life without him. She didn't need him now. Jake finally stood, his legs unsteady beneath him. He had been sitting for what felt like hours, but the thoughts in his head were still running wild. He couldn't stay here forever. He had to face the truth about Ella, about himself, and about the life he had been pretending to live. He walked outside into the cool night air. The streets of LA stretched out before him, empty and quiet. There was a stillness in the city that felt foreign to him. The noise of his thoughts drowned out everything else, and he couldn't escape the feeling that he had lost something that could never be found again. He pulled out his phone again, his fingers shaking as he scrolled through his contacts. His thumb hovered over Ella's name, but he didn't press it. He couldn't. Not yet. He didn't even know what he would say. What was there left to say? Instead, he typed out a message to Megan. I need some time alone. I'm not sure what to do next. The reply came almost immediately. I understand. Just let me know when you're ready to talk. But Jake, you need to face this. Whatever's going on, you can't run from it anymore. Jake leaned against the side of his car, looking up at the stars above him. The city felt distant, and for the first time in years, he didn't know where he was headed. He had spent so long building a life that wasn't real, and now the walls were crumbling. He had everything he thought he wanted, and it was all slipping away. As Jake stood in the middle of the quiet street, staring up at the stars, he felt the weight of his choices crash down on him. And just when he thought he had nothing left, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Ella. Jake stared at his phone. The message from Ella sat there, untouched, on the screen. We need to talk. His heart thudded in his chest. He couldn't avoid it anymore. The message had come at the worst possible time, when he thought he was just beginning to get a grip on everything. But the truth was that everything had already slipped through his fingers. He had always prided himself on being in control, but now he was trapped in a situation he couldn't navigate. He had never felt more lost. The bar was empty now, just the bartender wiping down glasses and a few patrons scattered around, nursing their drinks. Jake wasn't sure how long he had been there, but it felt like hours. The walls of the room closed in on him, and the city outside felt far away, even though it was just a few blocks down. He stood up abruptly, startling the bartender. I'll take my tab. The bartender nodded without a word. Jake fumbled in his pocket, pulling out his wallet. He didn't care about the money. It was just a distraction from the storm raging in his mind. He'd been running away from the truth for too long, and now it was catching up to him. He stepped outside, the cool night air hitting him like a slap to the face. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, but it didn't help. The anxiety, the regret, the confusion. It was all there, thick and suffocating. Jake leaned against the side of his car, staring at the empty street. The neon signs from nearby restaurants and bars flickered in the distance. The quiet of the night felt like an overwhelming weight pressing down on him. The city that had once felt so full of opportunity, so full of potential, now felt like a cage. He had everything he thought he wanted. Success, a new life, a new wife. But none of it had ever filled the emptiness that had been growing inside him since he left Ella. The truth he'd been avoiding was impossible to ignore now. He pulled out his phone again and stared at Ella's message. The words felt like a challenge, a reckoning that was long overdue. We need to talk. Jake took a deep breath and hit reply. Ella had been waiting for this moment. After the last encounter, She knew it was only a matter of time before Jake came to face the truth. She had always thought there would be closure. But now, she wasn't sure what that even meant anymore. She didn't need Jake's approval. She never had. But the question lingered, what had this all been for? What had their marriage been for if everything they had built together had been torn apart so easily? Ella stood in front of her window, gazing out at the city, her reflection merging with the skyline. She had come so far, but there was still a part of her that wondered if she would ever be able to leave the past behind. Jake finally started his car and drove toward Ella's apartment, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He wasn't sure what he was going to say when he got there. Was he going to beg for forgiveness? Was he going to admit that everything he'd said about her, everything he'd thought about her, had been wrong? As he drove through the familiar streets, memories began to flood back. He remembered the first time they'd driven down this road together, laughing about some silly thing he'd said. He remembered how Ella had always been there, steady and calm, while he had been chasing after something that was never real. He pulled up outside her building and sat there for a moment. The streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and the world outside felt distant, quiet, as if time had slowed. He took another deep breath, his heart racing as he got out of the car and walked toward the entrance. Ella's door was open just a crack when Jake arrived. He hesitated before knocking, but the quiet of the apartment made it feel like the walls were closing in on him. When Ella opened the door, she was calm, composed as always. But there was something in her eyes now, something he hadn't seen before. It was like she had already moved past the pain of their past, and maybe she was ready to close that chapter for good. "Jake," she said softly, her voice steady but not warm. "Come in." Jake stepped inside, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just another conversation. This was the reckoning he'd been avoiding for too long. Ella didn't ask how he was doing or why he had come. She simply led him to the living room, where they had sat countless times before. The memories of their past hung in the air like a thick fog, but neither of them mentioned it. They sat down across from each other, the space between them feeling vast. The silence stretched on, longer than Jake would have liked. He could feel her eyes on him, waiting for him to speak, to explain. "I messed up," Jake finally said, his voice rough. He couldn't look her in the eye. "I thought I was better off without you. I thought I had it all figured out." Ella didn't say anything. She just sat there, waiting for him to continue. "I was wrong," Jake said, his voice breaking now. "I was an idiot. I didn't see you. I didn't see what you were capable of. I thought you were just beneath me." Ella's gaze softened, but there was no anger, no bitterness in her eyes. "You were wrong, Jake," she said quietly. "But I don't need you to apologize. I don't need you to fix anything anymore." The words hit him harder than he expected. Jake opened his mouth to say something else, but the words were stuck. For the first time, he understood the weight of his choices. And as Ella stood to leave the room, he realized that this was it. This was the last chance he would ever have to make things right. Jake sat alone on the couch, the dim light from the street lamps outside casting shadows across Ella's apartment. She had gone into the kitchen, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He wasn't sure what he expected when he came here tonight. Maybe he thought he could apologize and everything would go back to normal. But there was no normal anymore. He could still feel the weight of Ella's words from earlier. "I don't need you to fix anything anymore." They haunted him. He had never truly understood what she needed until now, and it was too late to change the past. The apartment felt too quiet now. It wasn't like the old days when they'd sit together in this same spot, laughing and sharing everything. Now, all that was left was an emptiness between them, and he didn't know how to fill it. Ella reappeared, holding 2 glasses of wine. She handed one to Jake, her gaze steady, but there was no softness in her eyes. She wasn't angry anymore, but she wasn't forgiving either. She was done. Jake took the glass, his fingers brushing hers briefly. Felt foreign. Everything about this moment felt foreign. He had built his life on control, on being the one who had everything figured out. But right now, sitting in this quiet apartment, he felt more out of place than ever. You don't have to say anything, Ella said, sitting down beside him. I know what you're thinking. Jake swallowed hard. I don't think you do. Ella raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. I don't need your validation, Jake. I haven't for a long time. She paused. But you need to hear it. And I need to say it. Jake's heart was in his throat. He had no idea what she was about to say, but he was sure it would change everything. For the first time, he felt like he was on the outside of the conversation, looking in. I spent so much time chasing after you, trying to make you see me, she continued, her voice calm but firm. I was lost, Jake. And you? She sighed, her eyes flicking down to her wine glass. You were too caught up in your own world to notice. The truth of her words hit Jake harder than he expected. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't angry. But there was a quiet strength in her voice, a power he had never fully appreciated. I didn't see you, Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I never did. Ella didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a slow sip of her wine, letting the silence stretch between them. Jake could feel the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. The pain of their past, the way he had ignored her, the way he had treated her as if she was just a footnote in his life. It all came crashing down on him. He had spent so much time looking ahead, building his success, looking for validation from the wrong people, and now everything was unraveling. Jake, you weren't the only one who was lost, Ella said softly, her eyes meeting his. I lost myself too, but I found my way out of it. And I'm not going back. The finality of her words hit him like a punch. He had always thought that if he waited long enough, if he worked hard enough, everything would fall into place. But Ella had already moved on. She had already figured out how to rebuild herself without him. I never thought you could do it, Jake said, his voice raw. I thought you needed me. Ella shook her head. I didn't need you. I needed myself. The truth stung. He had underestimated her. And now he had nothing left to say. There was a long silence. Neither of them moved, both trapped in the weight of everything that had been said. Jake could feel the space between them growing larger with every passing second. The air felt thick, heavy with everything they had been through. He wanted to reach out, to fix everything, to apologize, but he couldn't. The words wouldn't come. I wasn't ready for this, Jake admitted, finally breaking the silence. I wasn't ready to see you like this, to see everything you've built. I didn't know how much I had taken you for granted. Ella set her glass down, her gaze never leaving his. You don't need to be ready. I've already moved on, Jake. I've already let go. Jake's chest tightened at her words. He wanted to fight. He wanted to say something that would make it all okay. But he couldn't. There was no fixing this. He had pushed her away for too long, and now she was too far out of reach. I never wanted to hurt you, Jake said quietly. But I did. Ella's expression softened. Just a little. I know, and I think I've forgiven you. But that doesn't mean we can go back to what we had. That person, he's gone. I'm not that woman anymore. Jake looked down at his hands, unable to meet her eyes. The truth settled heavily on his shoulders. She was right. The woman he had once known, his wife, his partner, was gone. And in her place was someone stronger, someone who had rebuilt herself from the ground up. I don't know what to do now, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't just talking about Ella. He was talking about himself. He was talking about everything. You'll figure it out, Ella said quietly, standing up. You always do. Jake watched as she moved toward the door, her figure framed by the soft light of the hallway. There was no anger in her steps, just a quiet determination. She was walking away, and this time, Jake knew she wouldn't be coming back. As the door closed behind her, Jake stood there in the silence of her apartment. For the first time, he felt the weight of everything he had lost. But something was shifting inside him. Something was breaking. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of him finally letting go of the man he had been. Jake sat on the edge of the couch, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The apartment was still quiet, but the silence felt different now. Less suffocating, more like the calm before a storm. He had spent so much time fighting the truth, running from it, but now it was here, sitting with him in the room. And it wasn't going away. Ella had left. That was clear. She had drawn the line between them, and no amount of apologies would change it. But even as he sat there, alone in the space where they had once built a life together, something inside him had started to shift. The realization settled in slowly, like the tide pulling away from the shore. It wasn't about fixing things anymore. It wasn't about trying to win her back. It was about finally understanding the depth of his mistakes and finding a way to move forward. He stood up and walked to the window. The city of Los Angeles sprawled out beneath him, the lights blinking in the distance. It was still the same city, but he felt like he was seeing it for the first time. There was a strange sense of clarity in the quiet of the night. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he had to prove anything to anyone. Jake's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He stared at the screen for a moment, unsure of who it might be. Megan. He hadn't answered her calls, hadn't texted back in days. But now, with the weight of everything he had learned about himself and about Ella, he knew it was time to face what he had been avoiding. He answered the call, his voice unsteady. "Hey, Megan." "Jake," she said, her voice warm but cautious. "I've been worried about you. I haven't heard from you in a while." "I know," Jake replied, leaning against the window. He couldn't hide the exhaustion in his voice. "I've been dealing with some things." Megan was quiet for a moment. "Are you okay?" Jake exhaled, his fingers tightening around the phone. I'm not sure, but I'm figuring it out." "Jake, I know you've been through a lot, but you don't have to do this alone. You don't have to face everything by yourself." There was a softness in Megan's voice, a kindness that he hadn't really allowed himself to appreciate until now. "I know," Jake said quietly, his gaze shifting back toward the empty space in the apartment. It felt cold, despite the warmth of the city beyond the window. "I've been running from the truth for too long. I thought I could fix things, that I could make everything work. But now I realize it's not about fixing things. It's about understanding why I made the choices I did." Megan didn't say anything at first, letting his words hang in the air. "Jake," she finally said, "you've got to stop punishing yourself. You can't change the past, but you can start fresh. You can choose who you want to be going forward." Jake's chest tightened at the thought. Who do I want to be? He looked out at the city again, this time seeing it with new eyes. There was a way forward, one where he didn't keep running from the past. One where he learned from it instead of letting it weigh him down. "I know," he said, his voice steadier now. "I'm starting to understand that. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm ready to figure it out. I'm ready to start over." Across town, Ella sat on the balcony of her penthouse, looking out over the same city that Jake was staring at. She had her phone in her hand, her thoughts still heavy from their conversation earlier. She had left him behind, but something was still tugging at her heart. It wasn't regret. It was just the lingering question of what might have been if things had been different. But that question didn't matter anymore. She had already chosen her path. She had already let go of the past. And yet, a small part of her wondered, would he ever truly understand? Jake set the phone down, feeling a small sense of relief settle in his chest. He had a long way to go, but for the first time in a while, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. He reached for his jacket and stepped out of the apartment. The cool night air hit him, the soft hum of the city enveloping him as he walked toward his car. He didn't know where he was going exactly, but he knew he had to take this first step. His phone buzzed again, and for a moment his heart stopped. But this time it wasn't Megan. It was a message from Ella. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Jake. You deserve it." Jake's heart clenched in his chest. He stared at the words for a long moment, letting them sink in. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an invitation to return. It was a simple truth. And in that moment, Jake realized that maybe he didn't need Ella's forgiveness to move forward. He had to find his own path, and he had to do it without relying on anyone else. He sent a quick reply, "Thank you, Ella. I'll make sure I do." As Jake started the car and drove off into the night, the city around him seemed to hold its breath. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was ready to take it on. But just as the road ahead began to feel clear, a thought crossed his mind. A thought he couldn't ignore. What if Ella was already moving on, too? Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.